you for the invitation, and thank you for getting up on a Saturday and coming to the periphery to listen to me. How many of you heard what I said at the forum on Thursday? I mean, you were not. Yeah, you were there. Yeah, bit less than half. Just so I have an idea. First, I thought I should first give kind of a general overview, kind of a helicopter view of the economy and how we should think about it. Then this afternoon and tomorrow, I was thinking we should talk specifically about finance and the interesting thing in economics is that in a sense it's cyclical. It is as you know, things go there's a very heavy economic policy, and then things get better, and then people say we don't need the policy, and perhaps that's true, and then there is a kind of a crash. It's like a little kid on a bicycle saying, "Look, Ma, no hands," you know, and then, "Look, Ma, no teeth," right? It's a bit like that, and I think that the West is approaching the "Look, Ma, no teeth" moment, and that I think we see in Brexit. We see it with Mr. Trump and Mr. Sanders in the United States, who are on the opposite political extremes, but essentially saying the same thing, that free trade doesn't work for the United States anymore. So I came to Latin America as an 18-year-old because I was working for a project with Norwegian students. We were collecting money for Peru, and I came from kind of middle-class Norway and found myself on one morning on top of the garbage dump in Lima, Peru, and I wondered why people there were so much poorer. And the interesting thing I thought was that the people doing the same things as in Norway were so much poorer. Let's say the taxi driver, the people who handle luggage at the airport, the waiters, the barbers, all were just as efficient as those I met in Norway. So why should a bus driver in Peru who was equally efficient as the one in Norway, why should he make 20 times as much money? If they were doing the same things. So I thought that's something that I'll look it up in a dictionary when I come back. And I tried to find it, and I went into business. I studied economics. I got an MBA at Harvard, and as I say, started my own business. And then before I was 30, I was still curious about this problem, which I hadn't found a solution to. So I got myself a PhD in economics, and then I looked back in economic history and I saw this cyclicality, and I saw that the same things kept coming back. So I wrote a thesis about these things, but then I sold my business about 20 years ago, and I went back into academia. So I think one advantage that I have is that I've been 20 years in business. I ran my own manufacturing company in Norway, in Italy, in Finland. So I know how it works. So I can say to the economists, that's not the way it works. I know that because I've been there. So I think I have that advantage of having the practical background. And also, I started. My first job was at the Latin American Institute in St. Gallen in Switzerland when I was still a student, and I was a Latin Americanist. I started study development in Latin America, and the interesting thing now when I come to the Ukraine is that so many problems are the same. You export wheat to Italy at a very low price, and then you buy the spaghetti back from Italy at 100 times more or something like that. Exactly the same thing as the same problem that Latin America had, and solved to some extent. The high cost of interest. I remember on a conference in Sao Paulo in Brazil was opened by the vice president of Brazil, who was a businessman, and he said, "Well, I have promised the president not to talk about the high interest rates. So instead, I'm going to talk about the high cost of capital." So these are they're very similar things, and that makes comparative studies so interesting. Every country is unique, right? But the gravity in economics is the same. So it's a matter of applying the forces at work in different contexts, right? And one very important context in the Ukraine is that you have a very big market. That is a big advantage, right? So Latvia got deindustrialized. 20% of the population left the country, but there's so many things you can't do in Latvia with 1 million people. You cannot build a solid, diversified manufacturing sector. But if you're more than 40 million people, you can. Right? So in a sense, the size, there's a minimum efficient size of countries, of economic units, let's say. And Ukraine is above that minimum efficient size. So that's good news. But I'll try to make a brief, an introduction now to the general theme, and then we'll dig into the details later. So this is essentially a short version of a 1 week's course that I give at Tallinn University of Technology, which is the same type of university as your polytechnic. It's what happened after 1860 was that engineering grew a lot, and the engineering didn't fit into the university system. So what they did was they actually established new universities to house engineering, right? And this is like your polytechnic and Tallinn University of Technology. But I think it's important that we see, what is it? What differentiates capitalism from pre-capitalist economies? What was there before capitalism? Because perhaps what we get after capitalism might have some similarities with what we had before capitalism. Some similarities. An Austrian economist who moved to the United States during the war, Karl Polanyi, he defines capitalism as having three fictitious commodities that did not exist before capitalism. And one is money. Pre-capitalist economies don't have money. So what do they have instead of money? Well, on the one hand, they are organized much like big families. That, inside the family, you don't pay for the milk in the refrigerator. The milk in the refrigerator belongs to everyone, right? So there is a system of reciprocity, which is, I get married, you all come and build my house, and I feed you. Then one of you get married, and we all come, you feed us, and then we all come and build your house, right? This is the pre-capitalist system, and it's socially based. And I'm sure that in the countryside, in the Ukraine, some things still function like that. Kibbutz, yes, yeah. And even in the cities, there is an American woman, Jane Jacobs, who wrote about this. Well, it's really like this, that you bring soup to a little old lady living on the 3rd floor, and in the meantime, the butcher watches your baby who is in the trolley. So in even in cities, this functions. So it doesn't have to be market, right? And I think one of the things that Polanyi says is that what we see is the market taking over more and more of the social relations. And then there is a reaction and there's a counter movement. Right? There are certain things where we don't want the market to enter. We have something called prostitution. That means that the market has entered in an area which we don't want it to enter, essentially, right? So money is important. And the other aspect, the other way of solving things without money is barter. In the Andes, for decades, for centuries, the barter was one sheep for one sack of potatoes, right? So you had a barter relationship between goods. And if you have 10 goods, that's okay. But if you have 2,000, it gets complicated. And then comes money, and money is, in a sense, an accounting unit. It's something very valuable, but in one sense, it's something very, very banal. An accounting unit. And what you didn't have was labor as a commodity. Labor was not something that could be bought and sold. You contributed to the clan by working. And I've been fortunate enough to work with the Sami reindeer herders in northern Norway, the last Aboriginal tribe in Norway, and they produce reindeer meat, which is a luxury product. And inside their system, like in the family, work. You work in different places, but you're not paid. You just get part of like in the family, you're being fed and housed. And labor as a commodity, the idea of buying and selling labor was not common. And private ownership of land. That the whole Western Hemisphere, when Columbus came, there was no private ownership of land. So this is the way it used to be. And it's good to have that, I think, in the back of your mind. This is Karl Polanyi, The Great Transformation from 1944, which is an important book because it gives you something to compare capitalism with. It gives you a standpoint to see how it really works. And Polanyi also wrote this book about trade and markets in the early empires, and he's exactly the opposite of Adam Smith. Adam Smith says in the beginning there were markets. So he says the difference between a human being and a dog is that human beings barter and dogs don't. Adam Smith says, have you ever seen a dog bartering a bone with another dog? No, right? So, and the other people say, well, the difference between an animal and a human being is that human beings innovate things. Right? Beavers, this is Abraham Lincoln. Beavers build houses. Just as they did 10,000 years ago, they don't innovate their houses, but they build houses. Human beings innovate, right? So, one of the interesting things about Polanyi, who's against Adam Smith, he says that in the early empires, first of all, trade were between tribes; they were not between individuals. And secondly, he makes the point that the traders were at the lowest. They were the lowest hierarchy. The absolutely lowest profession were traders, which is interesting to what we think about today. In fact, we know that there was in Constantinople, in Istanbul, one of the rulers was so ashamed of his wife's father's ships, so he had them all burnt because it was such a shame to be a trader. I mean, very strange. But human mentality changes, right? And there are two kinds of economic theories in a way, and they split up the English stage theories with Adam Smith versus the German American stage theories. Think that when the Europeans discovered America, or when the Americans discovered the Europeans, Europeans understood that they saw their own past. There was no agriculture, or in most of Latin America there was no agriculture. So they like, aha, we have all been like America. We have all been in a society where there was no agriculture, right? So that gave birth to these stage theories, and I think they're important. First of all, there was the age of hunters, right? Human beings made a living by hunting and gathering. Then comes the age of pasturage and shepherding. Same thing. Human beings found that they could actually tame these animals, and life became much easier when they didn't have to hunt for them. They could have tame animals, right? So that's the next stage of human being. And then the invention of agriculture. And an interesting aside on that is that agriculture, these agricultural societies seem to have started where the different ecological niches were very close to each other. I mean, if you were almost half of the population in pre-Columbian America lived in the Andes, and the Andes, you go from the seaside to 4,000 meters in 2 or 3 days. It's very close. So from where there is fish to where there is cotton to where there is maize to where there is potatoes, from sea level to 3,500, 4,000 meters, it's just a very short distance. And when I came to Georgia last month, where really the origin of Western civilization, we talk about Caucasian race, right? Agriculture was born in the Caucasus, I think for the very same reason, that the ecological niches are very close to each other. So you can have a huge diversity of agricultural goods within a very small geographic area. There's a short distance from cotton to potatoes, right? Or similar in the Caucasus. So then comes to Adam Smith. Then says the age of commerce, and the other says the age of agriculture and manufacturing. So all the neoliberals, they descend from the left-hand column, where commerce is the key. The others, where I come from, manufacturing and agriculture. So on the right-hand side, you see these are modes of production. I think this is 25 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, so we can use a useful term from Marx, which is modes of production. I think mode of production is a very useful term, whoever invented it, right? But the age of commerce, that's not a mode of production. All these things about, all these categories are about producing something, and then they pass to trade. And this is the problem. This is the problem why this theory cannot understand that it will be better for the Ukraine if they produce their wheat into spaghetti themselves, that would create a lot of added value, it would create a lot of jobs, than selling the wheat to Italy and buying the spaghetti back. This is, if you are on the left-hand side, you don't see it. So the task is to bring the public understanding towards the right here. Right? Yes.
I just have a question. I think that it's really in Ukraine it's a really different problem. I think because in Ukraine everybody knows that if you even from commercial side, if you sell high value product, you get more profit. But the only thing in Ukraine is have such really usual change in political and commercial life that a businessman really wants to invest minimum but get maximum. And in case in Ukraine you have assets already settled from post-Soviet times, and the businessmen try to utilize it as maximum as they can without investment. And if you do this without investment, you just sell raw materials. And if you utilize this rent, you will not be able to invest, and you just want to utilize as fast as you can, as fast as you have control over it due to a political situation or commercial situation. And that's it. Every businessman in Ukraine knows that if he produces spaghetti, as you say, he will get higher value. But he cannot, because if he invests money and something changes in Ukraine, he will lose his asset. That's it.
Yeah. So this is part of the vicious circle. That you know, political uncertainty produces short-term thinking, which produces poverty, which produces political volatility, which, you know, so the question is, where do you break that cycle? I think what you're describing is absolutely correct. The short-termism is a big enemy, and the high interest rates also, right?
Yeah.
So the higher interest rates is really part of the problem, and in one sense it's a problem of the lack of entrepreneurship. But I think the entrepreneurship is there if we can make the conditions better for the entrepreneurs, right? They could think more long term. I think that will be possible. So yeah, that is an important point. But you see, at the core of today's world economic order is the theory of David Ricardo. Have you heard about comparative advantage? If you could, yeah, most of you have. Okay. The comparative advantage is the idea that you should do what you're least bad at doing, right? And this is really, really at the core. So I think we'll do that now. David Ricardo wrote in 1817, at a time when the only industrialized country in the world was England. And the Americans at the time were saying, you know, you only developed this theory because you want to have a monopoly in industrial goods, right? So the Americans called their bluff the bluff of the English very early. But the problem is that the Americans then took over, when they themselves got rich, they took over the same theory, right? And the clue here is that David Ricardo's theory is based on the barter of labor hours, right? So David Ricardo forces us to think that what the world economy is about countries bartering, exchanging one labor hour for another labor hour. And whether that labor hour is in growing wheat or in producing spaghetti, that doesn't matter. If that, you know, we all understand that, you know, if you take the biggest hospital in Kiev here, and you take all the people who wash the floor, put them in one country, and then you take all the surgeons and put them in another country, you will have one rich country with surgeons and one much poorer with people sweeping the floor. You know, that common sense evades the people to the left, because to them a labor hour is a labor hour. And this is where we, you know, if you are at one point, I think if we try to improve Ukraine's situation, that is the core. This is the core of our argument. That you can say, economists don't tell their children, my daughter, you are so good at washing dishes, so you should make a career washing dishes in restaurants. No economists say that to their children, but they say it to the Ukrainian children. You know, right? This is unethical. Right? It is deeply unethical. Once you see what's happening. And as I was saying to Victor, I got very annoyed by this Swede at the forum who was saying to the Ukraine, well, yes, you have behaved a little bit better, but if you behave even more, we'll give you more candy, kind of thing, right? We'll give you more. That was, and knowing that Sweden has several times done exactly what the Ukraine has to do, which is temporarily protect their manufacturing industry. Sweden started doing that in the 1700s, and then they did it again in the 1800s, and then they did it again after World War II.
So we can't lose this productivity of labor.
No. It's an hour for an hour.
But
he uses productivity, yes, but it doesn't matter what the productivity is in. So if he uses an example of wheat, of wine and cloth. His example is Portugal and England, and Portugal produces port wine, and England produces cloth, right? So that is his example. But you could just as well use my example of washing dishes versus having an education, right? So that's the thing. You can, in the Ricardian model, you can have a comparative advantage in being poor. At the bottom of, if there is a ladder of skills, right? You can be the world's most efficient dishwasher, right? I mean, washer of dishes. I mean, it's not a machine, but a person. And I think this is crucial. And once you get people to think intuitively, all this is intuitively makes sense. But if you have brainwashed enough, if you have 3 generations of economists who have brainwashed that this is the age of commerce rather than the age of manufacturing, you're not getting anywhere. So, just to briefly work through with you, there are other types of stages. This is the one we had: hunting and fishing, pastoral, agricultural, and then another German economist who, well, you find that I've written about these things, but then you have independent domestic economy and the clan economy. If you go to Zimbabwe, where I've been 3 times in the last couple of years, you find that Mr. Mugabe is trying to run Zimbabwe in that mode, like a big clan. And that looks very corrupt. It is corrupt, but you have to. And I think it's very useful to understand where he's coming from. He's not only nuts. He's actually trying to use a model that works fine on a small level. And if you ask a Zimbabwean how many people are in your clan, they will say a couple of thousand. They know about a couple of thousand individuals that are in their clan, which is remarkable. At least to me, it's remarkable. So he's trying to run the economy like that. And of course, inside the family, you favor your own people. And I spoke to the Norwegian ambassador in Harare, in Zimbabwe, and he told me that he was the first Norwegian ambassador to South Sudan. And into the Minister of Economy's office one day walks his nephew. And he pulls out a gun and he shoots him. He shoots him because he has not given enough jobs to people of his clan. But can you see that from one point of view it makes sense? That, you don't feed your neighbor's children before you feed your own children. Come on, right? You want to feed your neighbors also if you can, but if you have to choose, you choose your own, right? So these are logics that are things that are logical in one context, which becomes pretty bad when they use in another context, right? Inside the family, Mr. Mugabe's logic is okay. And here I think there is a similarity with what's happening in the former Soviet sphere. Because there is a very interesting book written by an American who knows Russia very well, When Money Dies. And he writes about the fact that there was a shortage of money and there was a lot of barter. There was a lot of barter of favors, right? That in the Soviet economy, because of the planned economy, because of the inefficiency, even to improve the system, the the managers of the companies actually had to help each other outside the plant because the plant was bad. So they had to trade favors, right? And they traded favors for the good of the country. And also, if you were an individual, you wanted to see the doctor or the dentist, you brought little gifts, etc., etc., right? So, and some of the corruption in former Soviet countries, I think, come from this bartering of favors. Of course, when you're talking favors of $20 million, it's a different thing. But there is something here which in the West looks like corruption, but in effect was efficient under an inefficient planned economy. Just to put corruption also in a kind of perspective, not to defend it, but to see that some of this stuff was legitimate in the old system. Barter economy, and from the labor standpoint, this is a time where you slaughter your enemies. It's before you understand that you can actually use your enemies as slaves. And women doing all the work, right? Africa, and the beginning of slavery. And then you get slavery and you get serfdom. You get the main European model before capitalism was feudalism. And feudalism was based on serfdom, right? 1% owned the land and 99% lived on that land. And the one interesting fact which a historian actually pointed out to me is there were only 3 countries in Europe that did not have feudalism: Switzerland, Iceland, and Norway, which happened to be the 3 countries that never joined the EU. You know, when I say that in Brussels, people get very upset. Well, not upset, but there is something there. You know, I think, coming from Norway, we twice voted for the EU, and I twice voted yes, but the majority voted no, right? Because I think they saw Brussels as a kind of a feudal landlord, which it wasn't, but which it now is, I think. If you look at how the Ukraine is treated in the trade, they are in a sense like a feudal landlord. So, luck and magic, sacrificial and slave labor. I think what happens with capitalism and with manufacturing is the demystification of the world. This is Max Weber. When you get people into factories, something happens mentally that luck and magic disappears, right? And something also happens to religion. Handicraft, town economy, money economy, free labor governed by custom and trade. So there is something here about the town economy going with handicraft, that when the town started growing, that made people free. In many countries in Europe, if you were a serf, kind of a slave on a feudal farm, if you managed to escape and hide in the city for 1 year, you would be free. So the Germans have this expression that city air makes free. If you can escape to the city, it will make you free. And also, capitalism wasn't born in England. It was born in the Italian city-states, in the same places where democracy was born. Florence, Venice, Genoa, and also a bit later Amsterdam. If you think of all the terms in bookkeeping, they're all Italian terms, because bookkeeping was invented in Italy. And bankruptcy, which the EU should now recognize that some countries should go bankrupt. Greece, to start with, should be allowed to go bankrupt. That comes from Venice, where the first bankers had their desks, and when they didn't pay, when they didn't fulfill their commitments, somebody came up with an axe. The people who lost money came with an axe, and they smashed the counter. So bancarotta is a smashed counter. So it literally comes from that. So all these terms, giro, conto, all these things are a bit. Yeah, saldo, yes, agio, all these things. So for and in music also, these two things. If you look at the scriptures in music and bookkeeping is all Italian. Forte non troppo and these things. Then you have industrial, universal competition as an ideal, concentration and integration. This graph is from an American economist from 1903. Okay, but it's still valid. You see, universal competition as an ideal, but then you have to have, there's too much competition, and you get concentration, and you get integration, and you get trust, which you also do now. You see companies buying up each other. National economy, and then they say, well, we're going to have a global economy after that. And I think it's very important that Bruno Hildebrand, writing in the 1850s, he was saying, well, first you have barter, and then you have money, but then it will be credit. Credit, there's talk now in Norway, the banks want to get rid of cash. Yes. Individual, from the standpoint of labor, individual contract with increasing regulation by the state, group contract and regulation by statute. This is the way it worked until the fall of the Berlin Wall, in a sense. The labor had a monopoly, had some monopoly rights. There were trusts in business, these big companies, but labor also was a kind of trust. That trust being people who organize and make a monopoly of power. And I think if we look now that we understand the Cold War and the whole period since Marx produced his Communist Manifesto, I grew up in a country with a border to the Soviet Union, and that was very scary. We were very scared, and I thought communism was an awful system. Absolutely, it was awfully scary. Now I think we can see that communism actually served a purpose. It served the purpose of making capitalists understand that they had to share, right? Because there was a credible threat. There was a credible threat to capitalists, and therefore, they let wages grow at the pace of productivity growth, right? So this was what the French economists call the Fordist wage regime. That when productivity goes up, wages go up, right? So for a very long time, from the 1880s up until 1970s and 80s, the share of wages in the economy, the percentage of the economy that was wages, was very stable. And strangely enough, in the 1930s, if you look at the data in the United States, the share of wages in GDP actually increased, because many people lost their jobs, but those who kept their jobs kept their wages, right? And so actually, in terms of percentages, the capitalists lost more than the laborers. Yeah, so let's say 10% more or something like that. But it's significant that percentage-wise, as a percentage of GDP, capitalists actually lost more than the workers during the 1930s because of this irreversibility of wages. Wages couldn't go down. The labor unions made sure that wages couldn't go down. So there are some interesting things which I think came out of this trip. Not in Ukraine. No. Yes, and this is, I think this is what happened with the fall of the Berlin Wall. That ratchet wheel, a wheel which could only move in one direction. In mechanics, you have that. That came to an end with the fall of the Berlin Wall. So that's when we see the role of having the credible threat, communism as a credible threat. And here we enter into something which is maybe, I think, we've unlearned, and this is important for the Ukraine. The link between economic structure and population carrying capacity. If you go to the Amazon, you will find that 2 persons per square kilometer is a lot, because if you hunt and gather, you need a pretty big territory to feed yourself. Right? So sustainable population in that situation is very low. Agricultural societies. Did I get something about? Well, I got some kind of warning thing in there. But agricultural societies, normally you can get up to 40. So if there is an overpopulation in agricultural societies, people move. Eritrea is a country where I've been working, and you saw that when population moved to when the population reached 50 persons per square kilometers, the Eritreans had to leave. And where did they go? Well, they went to Holland, for instance. And Holland, there are 400 persons per square kilometer. Right? Nobody would say that Holland is actually overpopulated. But this is determined by the economic structure. You saw it very clearly in Latvia that when it got deindustrialized, people had to leave. So more than 20%, or about 20% of the Latvian population actually left the country. So I made that point in Brussels that if you deindustrialize, you're going to create a lot of refugees, right? Of people moving. So that's an argument for industrialization. So if the EU wants to create a lot of refugees, well, they continue with the policy they have. If they want to keep the Ukrainians, make it possible for them to make a living where they are, well, then they should industrialize. So only nations with a large manufacturing sector are able to feed a large population. I think this is very important. And another thing, if you look at where in the world there are famines, where people die from hunger, it's always countries where almost everyone produces food. India or Africa, where 80% of the population is in agriculture. Now, why is it that people who produce only food die from starvation, and countries where 2-3% of the population are in agriculture, like in the United States and Europe, we die from eating too much, right? These are the things, the kind of questions one should ask oneself, and then you see that this link, and this is not very well known now, but it was extremely well known after World War II, because after World War II there was a plan to deindustrialize Germany, because Germany had started 2 wars, and the century was not 50 years old, and they had started 2 wars, so the Allies decided they should punish Germany. And the worst punishment they could think of was to deindustrialize the country. So they prohibited the production of manufacturing in Germany. They filled the mines with cement or water or whatever, and the only thing they could manufacture was agricultural machinery. But then, the Russians came in and took away most of the machinery, and it was a disaster. But people in the western part of Germany, in the French zone, the English zone, and the American zone, they started moving into East Germany, because in East Germany they didn't have this Morgenthau plan. so they could still manufacture. And that worried the Americans no end, because they would see that the people were fleeing from capitalism into communism, right? Because it was a communism with manufacturing. So,
But why is Western Germany more industrialized than East? Western Germany stays more industrialized.
yeah, but I'm talking now 1946, huh? Yeah, and then the whole thing turned. Because President Truman sent a former president, a wise gentleman who was a mining engineer, Mr. Herbert Hoover, was sent to Germany.
Not for FBI.
No, not that. Not that's another Hoover. That's Edgar Hoover. Yes. Yes, he's the one with the Hoover Dam. Absolutely. And the Hoover Dam was a government project that produced electricity, that made it possible to produce cheap aluminium, which made it possible for Mr. Boeing, who came by chance to Washington State to build airplanes. So there's a link from the Hoover Dam to why they actually produce airplanes there, because they had cheap aluminium. So, but Hoover was sent on a fact-finding mission, I think the Americans would call it. And the third letter he wrote from Germany was the end of March 1947, and he says there is only one problem with the deindustrialized Germany. There are 25 million Germans too many, and then he says this fantastic thing, which must have shook Washington. What shall we do with them? Should we kill them? Or should we bring them somewhere else? If so, where? What do you do with the 25 million Americans, Germans that are superfluous when that can't be sustained, because they're going from the industrial society back to agriculture, right? And this phrase, I think, is probably the most important phrase in the 20th century. And it took 3 weeks, and the Americans turned the plan around very, very fast, and then at the Harvard commencement, I think it was the 6th of June 1947, the foreign minister, George Marshall, announces the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan is exactly the opposite of the Morgenthau Plan. It was to re-industrialize Germany, and while they were at it, they re-industrialized, they also put more industry into all the countries surrounding communism. This was a brilliant strategic move. How do you stop communism? Well, you make sure that the neighboring countries are so rich that they don't want communism. So it's starting in Japan, South Korea. They pumped a lot of money into South Korea. The interest rate in South Korea in the 50s and 60s was negative if you were in business. You got a minus 3% interest rate. Why? To stop communism in the north, right? And then, it was down to Taiwan, it was Turkey, it was Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal, all the way, England, all the way up to Norway. So they made it a sanitary belt around communism. And what I don't understand is that the EU now does exactly the opposite to the Ukraine. Right? Exactly the opposite. Why don't they understand it? Well, partly because economics has changed completely, and partly because people don't read history. But this is a dramatic failure. This is a dramatic failure. That if I were the EU and saw that the pensions in Russia are 3 times the pensions in the Ukraine, and this is a kind of incentive for people to become Russians, right? I would try to stop that, but they're so ideological that I don't think. So I think this is something we should think about. How do we communicate this? Who should communicate it to? By what means? At what level? Because there are some people in the EU. The previous head of the think tank in Ispra, he understands this completely. So there are people within the EU who understands it, but not the politicians, right? So everyone talks about sustainability. Well, here is the importance of sustainability.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
In case for example, you say that the EU should help somehow Ukraine, it's okay, but for example, for Norway, you discovered oil and you discovered like Norwegian people help themselves not to become like agriculture in source country, but they develop industry and so on without any help. They did themselves. So why Ukrainians cannot do the same? Like help themselves without.
Norway started industrializing in the 1840s, together with Sweden. Friedrich List, which we'll come to, is a very important economist. The first language he was translated into was Swedish. And I carry with me, in my wallet, I carry a Swedish banknote. Because I've just been to Sweden. And we were under Sweden. And this Swedish banknote, 500 kroner, on the one side of the banknote is a guy called Christopher Polhem. And Christopher Polhem died in 1751. And he said, Sweden, he was an engineer, and he said, even though we have very rich copper mines, we have to industrialize because the copper is going to run out. And the more copper we take out for every ounce, it's going to be more expensive, diminishing returns. Right? So here is their big hero. On the other side is a picture of the first central bank in the world, the Swedish central bank from 1661. The United States had a central bank in 1913. Sveriges Riksbank. And the Swedes are now throwing away this bill. That's why I'm collecting it, and they're putting an opera singer on the bill, on that banknote. So my Swedish friends are saying, well, we were entering the post-knowledge society. This was a banknote from the knowledge society, and now they're entering the entertainment society. All the new Swedish banknotes, except the 1,000 note, are artists. ABBA is the only people missing. But this was something that everyone knew. And they knew they had to put up infant industry protection. And they did it in the 1750s, they did it again with the second. For every industrial revolution, there has been a period of protection. So I grew up in Norway, in a country where it was prohibited to import clothing. Because the clothing business employed a lot of people. Not very well paid, but it employed a lot of people. I remember rationing cards for bread that my mother had to take ration. I was born in 1949, not in 44. So this went on for a long time. And I remember that when we went to Sweden, there was a lot to declare. Every bit of foreign currency was stamped into my father's and mother's passports because it was limited what you can get. And when we stopped at the border to Sweden, my mother went out, and the customs official put a piombo, a kind of a metal thing into her fur coat to prove that it had come from Norway, and because she wouldn't have been allowed to take the fur coat in if it had been bought in Sweden with black funds. I don't think this is a very nice thing to have, but I think it was necessary. And everybody said, well, do this for 10 years, and then we can have free trade. Right? And I remember my father, he had a car before the war, as a very young man. But only in 1960 could private people in Norway buy cars, because everyone knew that foreign exchange was a scarce commodity. Right? And this is it's not that I'm not that old, but these are things that was even in my lifetime. So there's a cyclical pattern of every time there is a new industrial revolution, there has been this period of protection. And if you read the first economics professor outside Germany was in Sweden, 1742. A gentleman by the name of Anders Berg. And in Anders Berg's textbook, they talk about the different economic fields of production. Is it? Of course, as we know, the real gold mines are not the gold mines, it's the manufacturing sector. And I read this 20 years ago, that, as we all know, what, 1742, did everyone know that? And then I discovered slowly that they did and where it came from. I will get back to that. But this cult of manufacturing is incredibly important. And everyone has been through it. England protected this manufacturing for 350 years, Korea for only 40, right? But they've all been there. And I think now is the time that Ukraine does the same thing, because nobody has ever got rich without it. Mechanisms of income distribution, town, family, labor mobility, national economy. The key thing is that in the national economic period, you moved economic activities. And now what do? We move people or we move money, right? So the alternative to moving people is actually to move people, right? So this is like Latvia. Latvia, all these Baltic republics were fairly advanced really during the 1930s. Estonia was richer than Finland up until the 1950s. Right? They were industrialized, but then they lost their industries and people moved out. So I think there is a very important break in the EU until 1989. Before 18, I think the EU is important for you to understand that when Spain joined the European Union in the 1980s, it was very gradual. Spain had very high income tariffs, and the tariffs were lowered 10%, about 10% a year for 10 years. And there was a lot of investment, cheap credit for Spanish companies. They really wanted to make sure that the Spanish car industry survived, because the car industry employed a lot of people and a lot of labor. Right? So there was a conscious policy in the EU. EU was in the business of moving economic activities. Right? So, and then EU, particularly after 2004, the EU is in the business of moving people. 20% of the population are not Latvian. So I think I was very much in favor of the EU until the evening of the 30th of April 2004. The evening of the 30th of April 2004, I was sitting in the Tallinn Opera House. And at midnight, Estonia and a lot of other countries would join the EU. And in Estonia and in these other countries, if you made €1 an hour, you were very happy. You were a winner. In the West, if you were a loser in Frankfurt, you would sweep the streets for €10 an hour. So I said, this is not going to work. If it was just the population of Estonia, we could absorb it, but not these millions of people, right? So I remember I sat there and I thought, well, this is the death of the welfare state. What I'm actually attending is, yes, it's very good news in a sense for these countries, but this has to be the end of the welfare state. I'm actually attending the funeral of the welfare state, and because those principles had been abandoned. If the Eastern European countries had been through the same process as Spain, wouldn't have been any problem, right? But the problem was that you had the shock therapy, and the shock therapy actually killed manufacturing industry before they had their accounting system. Before they had a capitalist accounting system, they were bankrupt. So this was really crazy. That shock therapy was crazy. And a year and a half ago, I was invited to the Gaidar conference in Moscow, and who is presented there as a kind of a big hero? Mr. Jeffrey Sachs, who was in charge of the shock therapy. So, in my analysis, is that the Russians suffer from from the so-called Stockholm syndrome, that they identify with the people who have kidnapped them and ruined them. You know, it's a very sad thing. And I actually wrote to a couple of Russian economists that you know, I think this is what's happening, and it's very sad. You know, you have to, you know, don't kill the guy, but don't invite him as a hero. Come on, this is so they don't understand it yet, but I think they will. I think this is the good thing about this period, that things move. So we have this problem of some countries really taking off and some countries not taking off. So when I went to school in Norway, there was one country called Somalia, which was richer than another country called Korea. And then suddenly Korea takes off. And this is not because Korea gets so much better in producing rice, which is what they used to do. It's because they changed their comparative advantage from agriculture into electronics and very high-tech stuff, with a very heavy industrial policy. And because the Americans knew that they had to sacrifice free trade for a while in order to stop communism. So unfortunately now there is nothing to do. Do you see the Asian crisis there, like a little bit? And what does Somalia specialize in? Piracy. Right? Robbery. Right. And when I traveled around Latin America in the early 1970s, Medellin in Colombia was the most successful industrial city in Latin America. What is it not known for now? Drugs, cocaine. Right? So there is a link here between robbery and economic structure. And I think there is a link in the same way with corruption, really large-scale corruption. Right? Corruption is like piracy and drugs, is in a way an escape clause. If you can't make money in a normal way, well, then you go into something which is illegal. So I think this is the thing with the arrow of causality I was talking the other day. You know, what comes first? I think manufacturing sector becomes first, and then society changes. And this was an Italian economist in 1771. He wrote a book, a best-selling book, and it says, "From manufacturing you may expect the two greatest ills of humanity, superstition and slavery, to be healed." And what do we see now in the Middle East? Well, I deal with the Muslim Council of Singapore, and I can tell you because they publish my things. So, you know, I think it's important to understand that the Muslims in Singapore behave very different from ISIS, right? Because one have manufacturing and the other don't. So it's not the Muslim religion; it's the Muslim religion producing what, right? Desert Muslim religion or manufacturing Muslim religion is very different. And I used to teach in Malaysia, and clearly the mentality on the East Coast, where there was no manufacturing, you know, young people were arrested for holding hands in the cinema. The case was taken to Kuala Lumpur, which is an industrial city, and the judges laughed and put them free. I mean, this is the mentality. This is so important. This sounds strange, but it's really, really very important, and it has to do with what Max Weber called demystification. Yes?
Question about Jeffrey Sachs, he's a financist, and how did it maybe it happened, the change of policies of countries of EU, because not manufacturers are ruling this world now, but financiers and bankers. And I read in Schumpeter, he talked about structure of ownership, or about the stock markets, and these stock markets leads to some derivatives and other options, and such persons like Jeffrey Sachs use this structure of ownership with stock, with derivatives, and because of this development of stock market, such persons now ruling the economy, like Jeffrey Sachs, and they don't understand that manufacturing very important, and they keep thinking like finances, like commerce.
That's absolutely. And I think we're not going to talk about this tomorrow. Tomorrow was talking about the financial crisis and what produces that. But that's absolutely right. The whole austerity policy is a product of, as a capitalist. I was a capitalist for 20 years. I wanted my customers to be as wealthy as possible. Because then they would buy my stuff. I wanted wealthy customers. And the idea, just the capitalism hating its own customers, that only happens when finance comes into the picture, and this is really very important. So superstition and slavery, and you see manufacturing is dying, and you see superstition coming back. That's and I'm saying, well, maybe also feudalism is coming back. And it is, and I've been invited by a colleague in Romania who runs the Institute of Geography at the University of Bucharest, and he tells me that in Romania, in the EU, wealthy people are buying houses, and they say to people who have no jobs, you can come in and live for free in my house, but when I need your labor, you work for me for free. That's feudalism, and it's coming back. That's really scary. That is really scary. So he's promised me to take me out to look at these things, and so we can say, well, what's logical? What do we get after industrialism? Well, maybe we go back to feudalism. But I think we also should go back to this idea of reciprocity. I think, and the sharing economy is in a sense part of that. We don't need to have 1.5 ton of metal in the backyard in the form of a car. Everyone, we can actually share, right? So these, I think, there are elements of these reciprocity thing. I own a car and you own a boat, and we swap. There are elements of that which can be brought back. So there is an axis here. Left, the market is the problem and the state is the solution, and the right, the state is the problem and the market is the solution. This is what we lived with. This dichotomy is what we lived with, right? And if we look back in history, it's that has not been. This is something fairly recent. I find that Arthur F. Burns, who was the head of the Federal Reserve in the 1970s for a long time. He writes economic papers and says, well, here Karl Marx was actually right. The president of the Federal Reserve, well, this was a couple of years before he came into the Federal Reserve, he could actually say, well, Marx has some points here about technology, and and that was possible. And after in this age of neo-ignorance that started with the fall of the Berlin Wall, that has been impossible to do. And you had Ronald Reagan, who told people that if somebody said, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help you," everybody should be very scared. This is breaking down, and I think we have a more relevant political axis, which economic structure matters. It starts with, and this is a list of people, some very decent people. It's not a list of people I like, okay? It's a list of people who all vote similar ways. George Washington, first president of the United States, produces a scandal when he's inaugurated because he wears a suit made from homespun cloth, meaning locally produced cloth. And everybody was sure that he would have the latest fashion from Paris. So it was a complete scandal. And he had written to a friend, Mr. Lafayette, and said, I want to make a statement when I'm inaugurated. We have to industrialize, and I'm going to show that by wearing an American suit. Abraham Lincoln, who was a great industrialist, he freed the slaves, and I think it's very important to understand the link between slavery and free trade. In the United States, there was a civil war between the South, which made a living from exporting tobacco and cotton. And the production of tobacco and cotton was made by slaves. The North wanted to industrialize. And the South was very afraid of that because they thought that if we protect ourselves against English manufacturing, the English won't buy our cotton and tobacco. It was kind of logical. So this was what the war was about. And everyone knew it was also about education, because everyone knew that a slave who could read and write was a slave which had no value because he would escape. So my short version of the history of Latin America, which I spent many years in Latin America, the short history of Latin America is that Latin America is a group of countries where the South won the Civil War. The interests, the raw material producing interests, which lost the war in the United States, in fact won in Latin America. That's why it took a long time to industrialize Latin America. It only started in 1950, very similar to the Marshall Plan. Stalin, of course, was an industry builder, right? Comes from steel, doesn't it? Mussolini also, Hitler. I'm sorry to say, the reason that Germany could have a war against Germany and Japan could have a war against the rest of the world for 5 years and almost win, was of course because they were very strong in industry and the Scandinavian social democracy, and even Mr. Pinochet in Chile, who was far to the right, very nasty person, but he understood the role of manufacturing. So after 1 year of free trade, he changed his mind. He saw that Chile had to produce something, and one of the things he did was to prohibit the export of Chilean wine in bulk. In bulk is like in tanks and things like that. So he made it mandatory for Chilean wine to be exported in bottles. Because if you export in bottles, you have the production of bottle, the cork, the labor, etc. The price is the export value goes up by a factor of 3 or something like that. This was completely against the rules of the WTO, but Pinochet still did it, right? So I tried to, the Chilean gentleman who was here, I tried to. Yes. I tried to explain him that from a point of view of people being to the right, Pinochet was the good guy for production, and he was a bit confused. So the opposite of neoliberalism is, in a sense, Pinochet and Mussolini and Hitler. So we have to distinguish between different people who are on the political right. There are those who understand economic structure and those who don't, right? And the neoliberals don't. Therefore, in spite of these people being awful people, they had the right policy. And so I think we shouldn't only distinguish between good people and bad people. We should distinguish between good policy and bad policy. And then economic structure does not matter. Well, we have David Ricardo, we have Manchester liberalism in the 1800s, neoliberalism today, and neoclassical economics ends up there. So these are the bad guys in a sense. But I think the important thing is that even the right understood this. And if you look at the growth of Spain and Portugal under Franco and Salazar, who were fascists, they had a very good growth in spite of being nasty people. So and the point here, they both come back to. Well, 100 years earlier, it was Mr. Pulem on the banknote. In 1841, it's Friedrich List and his book promoting industrialization. The national system of political economy, right? Versus the cosmopolitical. Right? And there's another important thing here also. If you think of neoliberalism and communism had one important thing in common. They were cosmopolitical ideologies. Right? In that sense, they were similar. And I think in the 1930s, you saw an awful type of of nationalism, but you had a much nicer, more simpatico type of nationalism in the 1900s. Norway was fighting for its independence from Sweden, which we only got in 1905. But at the same time, we were fighting for Danish nationalism. So when the Danes were attacked by the Germans, we went to Denmark to protect them, right? So it's not that my country is the only country. It's that, because I am nationalistic on part of my country, I think everyone else has that right when it comes to their country, right? This is the kind of symmetrical nationalism. I say, when I heard George Bush say, "God bless America," it was almost like hearing him saying that, "May God curse all the other nations," right? So that's not the nationalism I'm talking about. Bush was a Nazi. I've lived, my Norwegian wife and I, we even have 2 children born in the United States, so I know the place pretty well. But and George, 1 year ahead of me at Harvard Business School, the year ahead of me was George Bush in one class and Mitt Romney in the other. So I didn't know them, but I went to school with them. So I think I know I got the same education they did, right? So I know. But List is important. To the left here is a West German stamp of Friedrich List, the father of 19th century industrial policy, and to the right it's the same Mr. List on an East German stamp. And those who were at the forum, I made the point that Sergei Witte, who was working for the building railways in Kiev, who built also the Trans-Siberian Railway, he translated List into Russian. And here is another pair. The top is Jefferson, a very important American president, and he's on the $2 bill. How many of you have seen a $2 bill?
It's fake.
You have, yeah. But you know where it pops up? It pops up where the United States, the countries which have dollarized, because the Americans understand that it's much better to, if they're going to sell pieces of paper that never are going to come back, it's better to sell the same piece of paper for $2. So Zimbabwe is full of them. And last week I had a student in Norway, and I asked this question, and it was one person, and I knew she was from Palestine. Right? And these are the places where banks have to buy dollars from the Americans. But the interesting thing here is that Hamilton is a mere Minister of Finance, and and he was the one who set this American system. He created the American system of protecting the manufacturing industry. Right? Hamilton is very important. If you read his report on the manufacturers, you can almost talk to him and you can say, "Mr. Hamilton, why do you think the United States should have a manufacturing industry?" And he gives you like eight reasons. He's very important. And he got the $10 bill, right? And last year there was an attempt the Federal Reserve made the decision of putting a woman on the dollar bill, which was a very good idea, but they decided to take away Mr. Hamilton. And there was a public outcry. I even wrote an article in Norwegian saying, this is awful. They're taking up like with the Swedish guy, they're taking the important people off the banknotes. And we all said, get rid of Mr. Jackson on the $50 bill. He's the one who killed all the Indians. He's the nasty guy. Get rid of him and put a woman on the $50 bill, right? So this was an important discussion. But Jefferson was the one who said, the government that governs the best is the government that governs the least. So in order to understand the United States, you must understand that there is a rhetoric, which is that of Mr. Jefferson, and there is a reality, which is that of Hamilton. So if you look, for instance, and this even to this day, if you look at the trade negotiations, the Doha round on trade negotiations collapsed because the Americans said, we want generalized free trade, but everyone must understand that the American cotton producers need protection. Right? This is unfortunately the bad thing about the United States, that they, they had a vote last week, and they wanted to all the members of the Senate except one wanted to make it possible for victims of 9/11 to sue Saudi Arabia. Right? The president, who is a lawyer, vetoed, and one Democrat followed. Because as a good lawyer, Mr. Obama understood that if we allow that, all the people who have been killed by American drones, their families can go after us, right? So we can't do that, right? And Senate, they understood it after a while. But this is the problem of the United States. This God's own country. It's very bad to think that you're God's own country. That it's not good for your you become too self-confident. So Jefferson, when he was a president, he wasn't exactly as bad as he said he was going to be, but he killed the first central bank in the United States that had been established by Hamilton, and actually Hamilton was killed in a duel with Jefferson's vice president. So kind of nasty history if you go back. Mr. Burr killed Hamilton. But perhaps because there was a play on Broadway, Hamilton has been playing for full houses for 2 years. So he was very much in the limelight. So he actually was saved. So this bill survives, which is good news. So looking at different countries over long term. This is the United States. Don't ask me how these numbers came into being. These are the numbers made by an American economist called Angus Madison, and it's OECD, World Bank, everyone knows them. And I always ask myself, how did he get to those numbers? And I always find, well, it does make sense. So I think this is the best we have. So we can probably live in it. This is Western Europe, and notice this enormous bump of the years from 1950 to 1970, when GDP per capita was growing at its most. Look at Greece, Portugal, and Spain before they joined the EU. That's when they had the real growth. Even though their markets were much smaller, especially Greece and Portugal were small markets. Here is Eastern Europe. Here is the former USSR. Here is Latin America, muddling through. Here is Africa. But you see, all of them have their best period from 1950 to 1970. And then you have China and the East Asian tigers. Right? So the economic, this is growth per year, right? So if you start from a lower base, you can obviously grow very fast. But this shows the shift that is in world power, and part of this is technology. Part of this is what Carlota Perez, a Venezuelan researcher, calls a techno-economic paradigm. This is a techno-economic paradigm of Fordism. Right? Henry Ford invented the standardized mass production. Well, standardized mass production actually started during the Civil War in the United States, that they had to produce so many guns that they found out that they couldn't. Before then, every gun was made as a unique piece. But because of the demand of the Civil War, they started mass production, so that they made the gun barrels all alike, they made the locker mechanism all alike, everything was made standardized, so they could be put together in the end. So it wasn't one unique piece, it was mass production. This is a system that really took off with with Henry Ford. And Henry Ford, in 1914, he doubles the wages of his workers from $5 from $2.50 to $5 a day. That's right. And I think one of the reasons was that working with Mr. Ford's plants was very boring. But, it was like if you have seen Chaplin Modern Times, with this everyone doing the same movement all the time. But he used it brilliantly by saying that I produce so many cars, so I need normal people like my own workers. They have to be able to buy a car. So he, as a good capitalist, he wanted his workers to be rich. So he doubled their wages, right? And of course, if you can only do that if you have a big technological advantage. In a normal business, you cannot expect a normal businessman to double the wages of his workers, because probably that would create a problem if they're not particularly good. But this created this mass production, which was really perfection during World War II. They made tankers in two pieces, and they put them together. They mass-produced aircraft and everything. So this part of this is this fantastic technological revolution, which happened on both sides of the Iron Curtain. This is the cult of manufacturing on both sides. And Mr. Ford said in 1909, he said to his salesmen, tell the customers that they can have the car in any color they want as long as it's black. Because in order to have low prices, low cost, you have to standardize. And think of all the standardized products that you had in the Soviet Union, and that in China everyone was dressed alike, right? So this mass production was the basis for the planned economy. I think the reason that the planned economy was possible at all was that there were so few products, right? If it had been 20,000 products out there, it would have been impossible. So the mass production was the basis for the success of the West, but it was in a sense also what made the planned economy possible. And this is Carlota Perez and her husband Chris Freeman's argument, and I think it is an important argument. So now that we've got a distance to these systems, I think it's important that we can see that how apart from the political, they were very much alike. Communism and they ended up competing or going to the moon, right? And Russia won. I remember the Sputnik moment, right? And when the Sputnik went around the globe, and I also remember that the Americans sent a man into space, but he was sent into space up and down, but nobody told us that. We were led to believe in the West that this American had circled the world. So we were, circled the globe. We were victims of propaganda too, huh? But it not as bad as here. But still, the propaganda was there. So why don't we take should we take a 10-minute break or yeah, and then we'll go back and take this from a historical point of view. Okay. So tomorrow we'll speak more about the financial aspects, which I think are important. I think big changes in mentality have a strange form. They happen relatively fast, and when for a long time everybody knew that the world was flat, then should we say 40 people changed their mind and understand it was round, and then a whole new generation grows up knowing that it's round, right? It's a bit like that. And in economics and politics, this is what I call the 1848 moment. And I think we are in one of those. And then the few people who change their mind is are important. And the head of the EU think tank in Joint Research Center in Ispra in Italy, he quotes me and he says that the problem with economics is that the world is flat and round at the same time. It's just that the fashions kind of change. We go back and forth. There is no progress. And in that sense, that is not a lasting progress. Today is election day in Georgia, and it will be very interesting to see what comes out of it, because also there is a big array of parties, but I think there is really a shift going on. I've only been there once, but I, the people who were there, who had invited me there, there was a union of municipalities of all things. They kind of described this change, and when I went and visited the prime minister, he placed himself as a centrist, and everybody was surprised because they thought he was very neoliberal. So we are in the middle of this change, and I think it's important for the Ukraine to, and I think it's happening here too. I think we see it. What happened in Parliament on Monday was clearly very important. But I'm just going to give you the roots try to give you the roots of this. That for a very long time, everybody was convinced that the world was a zero-sum game. If some people got richer, it meant that some other people had to get poorer. So this was the medieval mindset. And then comes the discovery of astronomy, and there is an understanding that actually the whole universe may be expanding. That a whole new mentality comes in, and it comes into the social sciences via astronomy, really. And people like Giordano Bruno in Italy, and Copernicus was an economist and an astronomer. He also has theories of money. So then, with the Renaissance comes the idea that we can actually improve. The pie can grow, right? And a very important input into this was the Turks took over Constantinople, and many philosophers fled to Italy. And one of the philosophers fleeing to Italy, his name was, well, they call him, he had a complicated Greek name, but his name Plato. And Plato came to the West, and obviously in Constantinople they had read the Bible differently. And he said, well, listen, you haven't understood this. God created the universe, and then he rested on the seventh day. And he says that we are created in the image of God. Well, if we created in the image of God, we have to try to imitate it. Right? And what is the most typical thing about God? Well, it has to be his creativity. Created everything. So therefore, it is our pleasurable duty to invent new things. So innovation became a duty, right? And it was a pleasurable duty because it's fun to discover new things, right? And people were saying, well, God has made some kind of incentive system in order for us to populate the earth, to have many children. He has built some kind of incentive system into this, into having children, right? So they were reading these intentions of God into what they should believe. So creativity and populating the earth were important things. And then comes a very important thing with the role of money. We're going to talk about more of that tomorrow. But if you look if you read the Bible, there's a concept of mammon, and mammon is kind of bad money. That's money which is not circulating, right? And you remember the story about the master who leaves for a long holiday and leaves his servants or slaves, according to the language, and he gives 5 talents to one and 3 to another and 2 to the last one, and the last one buries the money. And burying the money is really bad. You know, you should give them. The master says, "You bad servant! You should have given the money to the moneylenders, so that the money can be usefully employed." So, on the one hand, if you look at the religion, we have God. We have Jesus throwing the moneylenders out of the temple, but we also have this story where the Bible says, you know, give the money to the moneylenders, let it work. And mammon is the kind of money that you bury in the ground. So we'll talk more about that tomorrow. But here, very early on, this is I think the first real, well, according to Schumpeter, this is the first treaty of economics. So Antonio Serra wrote this in a jail in Naples in 1613. He was helped by the Jesuits, we think, because the publisher who published his book also published Jesuit books, and he was in jail. He wrote the book. He was allowed to present his work to the viceroy. They all laughed at him, sent him back to jail, where he died a year later. You know, kind of a sad story. And there are about 7 copies of this book that we know about. It's a very, very rare book, and it was discovered about 140 years later. And when the first professors Genovese in Naples rediscovered the book and said, "Hey, you know, this is a guy who was 150 years ahead of his time." So, what does he say? The title explains it. A brief treatise on the causes which may make gold and silver abound in countries also where there are no mines. So, all the gold and silver that flowed in from the Americas to Spain left Spain and ended up in Venice, Florence, Amsterdam, Genoa also. His question is, why does the gold end up where there are no mines? Why doesn't the gold stay there? And he says, well, the thing is, what do these cities have? They have manufacturing industry. So he says, the reason that the money ends up in these cities and leaves Spain, you know, Spain got poorer by all this, and he explains that very well, and he explains this key mechanism which I'll get to. In 2013, well, we have a little fan club, Antonio Serra fan club, which is about as many people as in this room, or slightly fewer. And this is, I think, what we should do with Dugan Baranovsky. Okay. I have this hobby of making statues and memorial plates of famous economists. And what normally happens is that I suggest, well, I'll pay for it, nobody else pays for it. And then somebody else comes in and pays for it. This was actually the Banco di Napoli, the Bank of Naples, actually put up this memorial plaque. Antonio Serra, who was jailed in the jail of La Vicaria, on the 10th of July 1613, he published the first scientific work in economics. This is what Schumpeter is saying. This is the first scientific work, and University of Naples and the bank put up this plaque. So we have a very important development economist who is Estonian, Ragnar Nurkse, and when we had the 100th anniversary of his birth, we had the Estonian post office published a stamp, and the Estonian central bank put up a plaque where he was born. And we had Torstein Vevlen, who was an important Norwegian economist. We had a plaque set up of 150th anniversary. So this is a way to attract. So I think we should look into Tugan Baranovsky, and we still have time. Who can speak to the post office? Can we convince them into making a stamp for the centenary of Mr. Tugan Baranovsky? Could we get a plaque or a statue somewhere? There is this bust that but that's not here in Kiev. So I think it's important. Yeah. So I think it is important also because what the West is trying to do with the former East is to take away all pride in a way. I think it's almost a systematic attempt to take away everything that these countries can be proud of, and I think Russia was is in a sense even worse. That with the Olympics in Sochi, the new Norwegian Prime Minister went there, and the only thing she talked about with President Medvedev was homosexuality. Nothing else. And Medvedev, who was a great friend of Norway, he got so mad he didn't even show up at the press conference. And then I discovered that this is something that many seemingly was almost coordinated by NATO. That this was, everyone did this. This is not to defend Russia, but this is to say that it's a very you have to assert your own national pride. That's what I'm saying, right? And there's a lot to be proud of here. And Tugan Baranovsky is one, and this is one way of changing the discourse. Again, not to defend Russia. It's just that was an extreme case. So Mr. Serra actually had two dichotomies, which was lost in neoclassical economics: the financial economy versus the production economy, and increasing returns versus diminishing returns. So Naples was very rich in natural resources, but very poor. And he wrote in Naples. And the guy he was writing against, a certain Mr. DeSantis was trying to fix the problems of Naples by muddling with financial variables. He was trying to improve the economics of Naples by manipulating finance, exchange rates, things like that. And Schumpeter says, well, you can't do that. Serra says you can't do that. You have to do it in the real. You have to work in the real economy. And Schumpeter's understanding of Serra, which I think is very good, he says Serra is saying that if you take care of the real economy, the financial economy will take care of itself. Right? But you cannot, if you are a successful country, you'll have a positive balance of payment, etc., etc. You don't have to worry about that. So he will say that the most important thing was the real economy, and this was lost with continental European economists had focused on production, English focused on trade. Right? So the Germans would say to the English that the English are a country of shopkeepers, and the English would say back to the Germans, Germany is a country of bloody university professors, right? So there's kind of the insults, classical insults going across the channel. And then we come to a very important point, which I think which has to be understood: increasing versus diminishing returns. So, and the third thing is constant returns. This case, and this is crucial. If the Ukraine only produces wheat. And that's the only thing you do. Sooner or later, you will have to employ land which is not as good as the best land. You will start growing wheat up in the mountains. Right? So after a certain point, if you specialize, your productivity goes down. And the same thing happens in mines. And this is what this Swedish gentleman understood in the 1750s.
You specialize on raw materials. You specialize in manufacturing until productivity goes up.
That's right. And this is what Serra saw. Right? And if we take the intermediate example, constant returns, which is kind of neutral. If you ask a painter to paint a house, and he gives you a price of 100, and then you say, this house next to this one is exactly identical, in identical state. How much are you going to charge me to paint the second house? The painter will say, well, the same. The work is the same. Right? And that's constant returns to scale. That the cost doesn't go up, it doesn't go down, it stays the same. We can always argue with the painter that, well, the ladder that you use and the brushes that you can use them also in the second house. And if you start quarreling, we'll say, okay, I'll give you, instead of 100, I'll charge you 99, right? So, because theoretically there are some fixed costs that could be also used on the second house, but essentially it's the same thing. Then you have the increasing returns, which is what Serra describes. And think of Bill Gates. Bill Gates produces Windows 16 or whatever you want to call it, and that costs him $500 million to pick a number. And so unit number one costs you $500 million. Unit number two, if you distribute it electronically, it probably costs you 10 cents. So all the other copies, copy number one, $500 million, all the other copies, 10 cents. People like that this is increasing returns to scale. Not always as extreme as that, but it's costs going down. And people with that cost structure are very difficult to compete with. It's very easy to compete with a house painter. That's why there is so many more house painting businesses than people competing with Bill Gates, right? Because this cost structure gives what in business economics is called barriers to entry. How difficult is it to get to establish yourself in a business? To establish yourself in a truck driving business requires much less capital than to establish yourself in cargo air business. That's why there are many more trucking companies than air cargo companies, right? So this determines these increasing returns and diminishing returns. Really, this is what makes manufacturing so different. It's not manufacturing per se, because this can also happen in advanced services. The problem is that the advanced services also need the market of manufacturing. So you're still back to the fact that you need that you need manufacturing. So Serra was saying that he was describing Venice, which was rich, and he says that when the Venetians go into manufacturing, which they specialize in manufacturing, and when they increase their productivity, when they increase their volume of production, they lower their costs, and if their costs go down, they can both sell cheaper and increase their own wages. And since they sell even more cheaper, then they attract businesses from all over the world. So this is the virtuous circle. Your costs go down, and you can increase your prices, and your costs still go down, and your competitiveness goes up. Right? And then he also describes what we would call synergy. He also describes that Venice can do this specialization because there's so many different professions. So these people in the 1600s were actually saying, it's almost as if they were saying, if you want to understand how wealthy a city is, go into the city and count the number of professions. the higher the number of professions, the richer the city. And that applies today. If you go into Kampala in Uganda and count the number of professions, it's much lower than on Manhattan. Right? So these are very important insights. But the problem was that when economics got formalized, the first neoclassical economist, Alfred Marshall, in 1890, they chose a metaphor from physics, from old-fashioned physics, which was equilibrium. Right? And if you throw increasing returns into that, there is no equilibrium. So the economists, because of the tool they have chosen, had to kick out increasing returns. Right? Because it would ruin their equilibrium. And this is an important reason why neoclassical economics became such an important tool for neocolonialism. That the factor which distinguished manufacturing from agriculture was thrown out. Right? And this is why why neoclassical economics is such an important tool. Paul Krugman managed to, in the 1980s, create a model just like Serra. He didn't refer to Serra, but many economists have done that. This is what my thesis in 1980 was about. I actually went out to the world and read Serra, found him in the library, thought him was very interesting, and tried to see if it really worked. So in 1978-79, I spent my time in Bolivia with the tin industry, tin mining, in Peru with cotton, and in Ecuador with bananas, and try to see if the world actually behaved like Serra had said, and it did. So you had, in tin mining in Bolivia, you could really see it when production contracted. In the 1930s, the volume of the demand for tin went down, and productivity skyrocketed. Why? Well, because they closed the most marginal mines first. No, that's a very logical decision. If you're a mining company, demand goes down, you close the worst mines first, and you stay with the best mines. So, and it happened with cotton in Peru, and it happened with the bananas in Ecuador. So this is, if you put these factors in, increasing and diminishing returns, it's very easy to make a model showing that some countries will specialize in being poor. It really explains that Somalia, Korea thing. Right? So the problem is that the economists have locked themselves into their own tool shed. And the problem is also that this theory that they produced was in somebody's interest. It was in somebody's interest to believe in that, right? And this is the interesting thing with the United States, that when this was still only based on Ricardo's bartering of labor hours, the Americans called the bluff. And the Americans were saying, well, when the United States has 100 million people, when Philadelphia is the greatest manufacturing industry in the world, and when the U.S. Navy dominates the world, then our grandchildren's grandchildren will declare free trade. And that happened around 1916. So they saw this 100 years earlier. And they also refer to the Bible. And they say, well, in the Bible there are some tribes of Israel who are the hewers of wood, the drawers of water and the hewers of wood. Those who were making a living carrying water and chopping wood. Right? The Americans are saying, we don't want to be the people in the world chopping wood and carrying water for the others. We want to advance, right? And in a sense, so these arguments, they come back in history time and time again, but from a slightly different point of view. But the core problem, the core issue is increasing versus diminishing return. This is why Mr. Yufin Lin, who was Justin Lin, who was the chief economist of the World Bank up until about a couple of years ago. He wasn't that for a long time. He said, no country in the world has ever got rich without a manufacturing sector, except some oil-producing countries. You have a question?
I have a question. Do you agree with the thesis that if you focus on, for example, agricultural economy and develop it and invest in it, you cause it will lead to industrialization, because by developing agriculture, by investing in it, by constructing silos, constructing this, you will cause developing of processing industry, or for example oil production, or sunflower oil, or bread, or whatever, by actually pasta.
Yeah.
So by developing raw materials, you will cause develop and investing in it, of course, not just utilizing credit, but investing in it, you will cause industrialization in this way. So, for example, if Ecuador develop agriculture and banana production, but also invest in I don't know, like banana juice or whatever, jam.
Baby food. There's also banana puree in baby food. Yeah.
Does it work?
Well, I think if transportation is cheap, it won't happen like that. The tin in Bolivia was taken to Liverpool to be melted for 150 years.
So we have the same problem in Ukraine. We export wool, but we could produce furniture. Why are we exporting wood to Turkey and then import furniture from Turkey?
Absolutely.
We can produce it on our home.
That's right. And that has never happened without some kind of protection. Sometimes the protection has been involuntary, like the United States. The United States, we had fantastic theories from Mr. Hamilton, but industrialization only really started with the Napoleonic War, where there was a continental blockade. There was a blockade of US trade. Their trade fell by more than 90%, and they had to start producing themselves. The same thing happened in South Africa with the apartheid. Because they had apartheid, they were boycotted, and they could develop. So, but there's a very important mechanism here, which is wages. And the Australians had a very good argument here. They had some 1920s. They had a couple of reports, the Vernon report and another industrial report. And they said, well, we should really only produce wool. But if we produce wool, we will start having sheep in areas which is less productive than others. And the price of wool in the world market is not going to change, so our wages will go down. So the Australian argument was that in order for our wages not to follow into diminishing returns, we need a manufacturing sector that will create a relatively high wage. Yeah. And the existence of the manufacturing sector will prevent us from going into diminishing returns. Yeah. And I think this is a key thing. Why is agriculture in Africa so primitive? Well, because labor is free. Right?
Yeah, but they don't want war.
Well, I'm not so sure. I think once you get into the spirit of improving things, it's I've been the main speaker to the Industrial Association of Zimbabwe, with 170 industrialists, of which 3 were white, and they were very brilliant group of people. So, but the fact that if you have a manufacturing sector, you will also have the technological. First of all, you will change the wage level, because when people can find higher wages in the city, that will force up the wages in manufacturing. And also, the proximity to manufacturing will bring the technical skills that are needed for agriculture. Mr. Ford, after a while, he started building tractors, right? But it's difficult to employ, why don't they employ more tractors in Africa? Well, first of all, because capital is so expensive, just like here. And second of all, because labor is so cheap. And third, they don't have the skills. So it's this was something that was discovered only around 1750. And it was David Hume, the English philosopher, who has a wonderful phrase that the best way to help agriculture is to help manufacturing. Hume, who was a kind of conservative philosopher. So the fact that these, nobody is against agriculture. I think what we're only saying that in order to improve agriculture, you need an industrial sector for the wages, for the skills, everything. So this synergy is important. Well, we're going to talk more about the financial sector tomorrow, but this is Schumpeter. There are two spheres, right? Here is the productive spheres, and here is the capital. Here is the money, and here is what you can buy for the money. And you have to separate these things well. And neoclassical economics doesn't. After Ricardo, they didn't really distinguish between the financial side and the real side. And as Keynes would have said, the financial sector is a bridge in time. That if you want to build a house, you want to build a factory, you go to the financial economy and you get money for the next 50 years to build a factory or to build a house, 30 years or whatever it lasts. Right? So here is all kinds of production of goods and services, which somebody called the Güterwelt, the world of goods and services. And here is what he calls the financial economy, and he calls them Rechenpfennige, which is like accounting units. It's not more mysterious than that. Money is just accounting units. There's nothing mythical about it. And the post-Keynesians, building on that, they create good solutions. I have a colleague in Tallinn, an American whose name is Jan Kregel, and Jan Kregel was the one who wrote the so-called Stiglitz report on the financial crisis. But Jan Kregel was a consultant to the Cuban government. And Cuba had two currencies. They had a peso, which was completely devalued. You only use it on the market to buy vegetables and things like that, or books. And then they had the US dollar. But they had too few US dollars, because normally they had more of a purchasing power abroad, so the tourists were taking them, they didn't have enough dollars. And Mr. Kregel says, well, we'll solve this. This is the way to solve it. The Cuban central bank should start printing notes saying, we, the Central Bank of Cuba, promise to pay against this note $10, $50 or whatever. So he actually made the Cuban government, he put the Cuban government in the position of printing dollars, which of course only would circulate in Cuba. But the point is that if they didn't exaggerate this, if they didn't print so much that it was inflation, this is just like a letter of credit. I promised, I owe you, as the Americans say. We promised to pay a promissory note. So, if you have this more pragmatic view, the Keynesian view, which also comes from Schumpeter, that these are really only accounting units, then it's possible. It would be possible also in the Ukraine to have several currencies. Now, this is just I don't know if it would work here. It probably works better in Cuba because the economy has been so closed. But an example of how creative you can be if you have a non-ideological relationship to money. So, in good periods, these are in balance. They live in symbiosis, right? But in bad times, which we talk about tomorrow, the right-hand side becomes like it grows too fast, and it becomes like a parasite. You know, this is what we're seeing in Greece right now, that the financial economy actually shrinks the real economy, but we'll get back to that. And we have to separate good greed from bad greed. I think this is very important. And he's another Italian economist, Pietro Verri, same year, 1771, another Italian economist. The private interest of each individual, when it coincides with the public interest, is always the safest guarantor of public happiness. Right? So Adam Smith said, it's not by the goodness of the baker that we get our daily bread. We get our daily bread because the baker is greedy, he wants to make money. But as long as he makes money by baking bread for us, that's fine. But what happened with neoliberal economics, that they took away that middle of the phrase in italics. The private interest of each individual is always the safest guarantor for public happiness. And then you get Gordon Gekko, right? Then you get people who actually make money from against the public interest. I'll give you an example. The French Revolution was a product of at least 15 years of shortage of bread in Paris. And these were the physiocrats. They had the theory that the market would solve everything. But for a long time, it was more profitable to take money out of to take grain out of Paris and wait for prices to rise. So there was much more money to be made from not baking bread than from baking bread, right? And this is it doesn't coincide with the public interest. And there was one important economist, Mr. Necker, who was an anti-physiocrat. And actually, the French Revolution broke out when news reached Paris that Mr. Necker had lost his job as a Minister of Finance. So the whole French Revolution was about speculation. And it was about economic theory. The physiocrats, who are now kind of the grandfathers of neoclassical economics, they lost out. And I think this is what we have to bring back. But it cannot be brought back in neoclassical economics, because in neoclassical economics there is no such thing as public interest. It's a theory only based on individuals. As Margaret Thatcher says, you know, when she said there is no such thing as society, she was just restating an assumption on neoclassical economics. So this is the problem, that neoclassical economics is there is no state in there. There is no society, right? And therefore they don't see when capitalism comes in conflict with society, like in the French Revolution. You know, we get into these whirlwinds of financial crisis. We don't have time to talk much about energy, but if you use Mr. Serra and for the energy crisis and say diminishing and increasing returns, since the Industrial Revolution, the world has lived on extracting energy, coal, gas, oil. Extraction is always subject to diminishing returns. But if we can, and there is reason to be pessimistic, but if we take Serra's view, can we produce energy without diminishing returns? Yes, if we harvest energy. You know, harvesting is by harvesting energy. If you harvest the wind, there is not less wind. You know, you just harvest it and it comes back. And similar thing here. You see, these are this is a learning curve of cost reductions for solar panels. You see, here is an index. 100 and it goes down to 0.1. And you see that from 1978 till this is the last line from 2011, you see that the costs going down fantastically. Right? And this, we'll get back to this when we talk about the Industrial Revolution. But you see, the kind of cumulative learning is what makes things possible. And by subsidizing for a while, if you subsidize solar energy up here until it gets profitable, that's good business. Right? But it could be too much for a company to do. But Germany has done a good job in what they call the Energiewende, the change in energy. So there is a trench war out there between the technology optimists and the technology pessimists, right? And I'm trying to say what we have to do is to see where can we be optimistic? Well, we can be optimistic in harvesting energy. Right? If we continue to extract energy, it gets will not be able to do it. So this is a very important. This is a very important curve because it shows the typical. It shows the way economic growth takes place. This is the mechanization. This is the first industrial revolution. The mechanization of cotton spinning. So you see here, in a few years in the late 1700s, the cotton spinning in England, the productivity increase was more than 25% a year. Fantastic productivity. And then it comes down to the normal and it flattens out. What we think of as economic development is really a sequence of productivity explosions like that. In the early 1900s, it was Henry Ford. He had a similar productivity improvement. And those of us who are old enough to remember the 1990s, we remember the price of computing coming down, right? Similar to this. In computing, there's something called Moore's law, and Moore's law says that the productivity of the silicon chip doubles every 18 months, and that has been going on since he formulated that in the 1970s, and seemingly it still works. So computing is on this curve upward, but of course, no tree grows into heaven, so at one point this is going to stop. But then there are two kinds of economists, right? Those who say, like Adam Smith, who was writing here, oh, look what free trade can do. And the rest of us would say, look what technology can do. Because, of course, if you are like England, the only country in the world with this kind of productivity explosion, you get filthy rich, right? So everyone at that time, all countries, Germany, Sweden, etc., that we have to get into this industry as well. We may not be as efficient as the English. Maybe we only get 20% a year in productivity increase, but we will still be better off than having only agriculture. Right? So this has been the logic that comes again and again. Which skips that. So I think to explain where we are in I'm talking about these 1848 models, right? You have a Canadian economist who described the cycle that I'm trying to describe today, that with the role Trump plays and Brexit and all this. So Harold Innis, Canadian, said, look at it like this. Science, which is communicated in Latin, gets more and more abstract and enters into alliances with the political elites. This is neoclassical economics and Western capitalism. Right? And the Latin is mathematics, or equilibrium mathematics. Torstein Webel called it vested interests, but that's another thing. And resistance to the ruling paradigm and the elites builds up among the vernacular. Vernacular was all the languages of Italy that were not Latin. Those who don't speak Latin and speak another language. resistance to this paradigm builds, and an overthrow may take place after a shock to the system. This is why I'm so happy about Trump, although I hate the guy, but because he is producing that. He is producing the shock to the system, which makes it collapse, and so did Brexit. But it's incredible how this guy, he lived in the trenches during World War I. An extremely interesting character. He's known in Canada because he talked about fur trade and things like that, but he talks about important things here. And then he said, Western civilization is again and again saved by knowledge that for a time only survives in the periphery. Hyman Minsky was the guy who spent his career saying, it can happen again, it being a financial crisis. If you believed in Hyman Minsky, the only two places you got a job was University of Missouri, Kansas City, and Bard College, upstate New York. So if you believed in this, you had to sacrifice your career to a third-rate university. And some people did. Jan Kregel, who I mentioned. So when the financial crisis came, suddenly everybody said, well, this is Minsky. And the Minsky, everybody talks about the Minsky moment and this thing. So I find it incredible that this guy saw this so clearly. And the importance of that shows you the importance of keeping different theories alive. Right? Because if everybody thinks alike, at one point everybody may be wrong at the same time. Right? and it's not that people are always right. We just need the diversity. I think this is clear. Now this is what we lost. And this is countries like Brazil has a big diversity in economics, and Turkey has had. These are the two countries which for some reason, unknown reason, have had a diversity of economists, which is very healthy. So there are really two types of economic theory. I think this is the best-selling economic book, history of economic thought of the 20th century in England. Types of economic theory. Right? This was before the World War II. People understood that there was something, that there were different types. Right? And interestingly enough, Wesley Clair Mitchell, who was the best-known American historian of economic thought, he also wrote 2 volumes with the same title, Types of Economic Theory. And this is important. There are types of approaches to medical science, and that's useful. Nietzsche tells us that objectivity is achieved by looking at an object from as many angles as possible. To have an objective view of this building, you would ask for the architect plans, you would ask for aerial photos, you would ask for photos from all 4 sides, right? Objectivity is seeing a thing from as many angles as possible. I think that's a very healthy principle. And the problem with economic theory is that it's been a monoculture. It's only looked at the world from one angle, right? And when an angle which didn't see deindustrialization was not important, financial crisis couldn't happen, and then you have this physics-based, classical mainstream, and you have the experience-based, Schumpeterian, evolutionary, institutional, what I call the other canon. The alternative canon, which is much older than the mainstream canon. So when I was teaching economics in the United States in the late 70s, this is very bad. But what it says here is that here's Aristotle and the Bible, here's Adam Smith, and here's David Ricardo. And here is Karl Marx, Lenin, China, USSR, and the New Left, coming out of Karl Marx. And here is John Stuart Mill, Baudin, Marshall, Keynes, post-Keynesian mainstream economics. But the interesting thing here is that both come from David Ricardo. So Ricardo was the father of both Marxism and Western economics. And he was the one who didn't distinguish the real economy from the financial economy. He was the one who used only bartering labor, right? So Ricardo, in a sense, is the root of all evil, both left and right, which many people. So I thought when I was teaching this in the late 70s that, well, the right-left axis from one angle is just a civil war between Ricardians to the right and Ricardians to the left. It was very confusing. So I started looking for people. Well, there must have been someone who didn't didn't agree with Ricardo, and I found them. And I built my own family. I built my own family tree, which will come up afterwards. So back to this dichotomy. Note 1994, which was the peak of triumphalism after the fall of the Berlin Wall. One of the nice things about economics is that it's only a way of thinking. Factual knowledge does not exist. Very important. Don't disturb us with facts. Right? Don't confuse us with facts. And that's so when the facts like deindustrialization, financial crisis comes up, people are not prepared. Right? They're just not prepared. And then you have the German philosopher Gadamer. The root of everything we can call theory is to observe things as they are. So I think you have to make up your mind here. You know, either you're that kind of economist and that kind of, or that kind of economist. You know, and I think more economics understanding this now and slowly moving in the direction of putting facts in, but they're putting it in an ideological framework which is not constructive. And here is my alternative family tree. So, which is, you know, this is a 2-week course. This slide here. You have the Renaissance. You have Giovanni Botero, extremely important. I bought an old Botero book from published in Venice in 1622. And I found out that my copy was the 62nd edition. The 62nd edition in like 7 years. You know, he's an enormous bestseller, and we're publishing things about him now. There's a book coming up. Botero, and he describes this, but Serra is the one who understands the theory behind it. He says the wealth that Botero relates to industry is there because of the basic returns. So Serra puts in the little theoretical piece to explain why Botero was right about manufacturing. You know? And the Swedish guy who copied it in 1640, he got it from Botero. So you have Tudor economic policy in England, 1485. Henry VII comes to power, a young man who has grown up in France, and he becomes the King of England, and he says that where he grew up in France, everybody was making cloth, and the whole city was rich. But the raw materials from the cloth came from England. And he comes to England, and England is dirt, is very, very poor, indebted to the Italian bankers. 3 years of wool production is their debt. And he says, we're in the wrong business. We should be, instead of being in the wool business, we should be in the wool and textile business. And he starts putting up export duty on raw wool, and Elizabeth I, who comes afterwards, Henry VII and then Elizabeth I. Elizabeth I, when they have built up enough capacity to produce woolen cloth, they prohibit the export of raw wool. And here is a parallel to Ukrainian scrap iron, right? And Elizabeth I actually had death penalty for exporting raw wool, and here in Ukraine it was agreed not to have death penalty to export scrap iron. So then in France, a gentleman by the name of Lafayette who fixed this up, 1597, and then the man who was always called the Great Colbert. Colbert was the man who developed France. He built infrastructure. He abolished all internal duties, because inside countries there were tariffs. There were many tariffs inside France. And in Switzerland, there were tariffs between the Swiss cantons until 1849. These are things that nobody thinks about. So, Liszt is the man who says, well, get rid of the tariffs in bigger and bigger areas once you've industrialized. And that's what happened. And then you have Germany, very interesting, and I have in my book, I have Mr. von Honig's 9 principles. And here you come into cameralism, and you come to German historical school, you have Liszt, who is important, and you have Daniel Raymond, and here you have Hamilton, the US economist by name Raymond, US industrial policy. You have a student of Raymond, Pershing Smith, who becomes the first US economist to work in Japan. You see him dressed him up as a samurai, and he takes Raymond's and Liszt's ideas to Japan. So when Japan opens up in the 1860s, they only allow in German economists or American economists who have studied in Germany. And they translate very selectively what they want. Marshall, the founder of neoclassical economics, they take his book on industry, but not his theoretical book about comparative advantage. So they were very, very clever in picking exactly what they wanted. So Veblen is this American created institutional school. You have Japan here, and you have revolutionary economics coming from Schumpeter, and you have Marx to the left and Schumpeter to the right, who both understand technology. And Schumpeter says in the introduction to the Japanese translation of his book on economic development that people don't really see how similar my theories are to those of Marx, because we're politically so different. Because we come from two political extremes, people don't really understand that the basic thinking of a system which is where growth is generated by innovations inside. Right? This. And then you have people in the middle, Schmoller in Germany and Sombart in Germany, and the only one who is kind of the immaculate conception, who looks like he's coming from nowhere, is Keynes. But Keynes actually, his father, John Neville Keynes, actually is very close to the German historical school. Unfortunately for us, Keynes didn't study that much economics. He studied philosophy and other things, so he wasn't brainwashed. So he came up in the 30s with a very pragmatic theory. And Schumpeter and Keynes were both born in 1883, the same year that Marx died. So you have generations here. Also in literature, Spanish literature, you have the generation of 1998. Well, in economics, you also have generations in a sense, and I think this is what we'll be seeing more of now. So we saw this one, we saw that one. We're trying to explain that one, and when the Berlin Wall came down, and you had this fantastic triumphalism that the market would solve everything. So the Washington institutions, which is the World Bank and the IMF, they started out by saying, get the prices right. If you just stop messing around with the economy and get the prices to the right level, things will take care of themselves. In 1990, I was an advisor to a friend of mine who we studied at Cornell, and he became the main advisor to President Fujimori of Peru. So I was a lot in Peru in 1990, and Mr. Fujimori went to Washington, and they said, well, just get rid of the guerrillas and get the prices right, and development will come by itself. Well, Fujimori did it. He got rid of the guerrillas and got the prices right, and nothing happened. So then they say, well, get the property rights right. The problem is that there are no property rights. Well, the problem with that is that, well, in the slums of Latin America, people normally don't have property rights to their land. And if you give them property rights, they can actually take up loans, which is good if they're going to start a business. So from one point of view, this is very good. But what has been shown in Latin America is that people who don't have any experience in the market economy, if they take up loans, well, you take up a loan because your child is sick and it needs medical attention, right? So these people who got property rights out of nothing, in the slums, very often they lose their money. So it's much more than property rights, although property rights is important, but it doesn't solve the problem. And then they say, well, get the institutions right, and they don't understand the error of causality. Insurance was invented in Venice because the Venetians had long-distance sailing, which was very risky. And they tried to solve that problem by having 40 people each owning 2.5% of the ship. That was very cumbersome. So instead of this cumbersome ownership, they invented insurance, a pool of risk in an insurance company. The World Bank would say that the institutions come first. It's like corruption, right? First came the need for insurance, and then they invented insurance, right? So the World Bank and the IMF tends to get the error of causality always wrong. And I think to some extent that also applies to corruption. And then get the governance right. Remember, the state, you couldn't say that word, but when they understood that they needed the state, they started to talk about governance, because the state had become a bad word. Get the competitiveness right. That was the next one. Get the innovations right. But they don't understand that in some economic activities, there are zero innovations. If you're producing baseballs, which is my classical example, there hasn't been any technical change at all. And these blind alleys, technologically blind alleys, this is where the poor are specializing. Get the entrepreneurship right. If you live in a slum in Latin America, you have to be extremely entrepreneurial every day in order to survive. They're much more entrepreneurial than people in Europe. Get the education right. Problem is, if you educate people and you don't have an industrial structure, you're just educating people for migration. And this is what I'm afraid of in Ukraine. That you actually, the better educated they are, the faster they leave, which is kind of nasty. Get the climate right. Oh, it's because people are lazy in the tropics. Well, look at Singapore. It's 3 degrees from the equator. Get the diseases right, and then it was because there's so many tropical diseases. That's why it doesn't work. Well, there was malaria in the Alps. There was malaria up to 1,000 meters in the Alps 300 or 400 years ago, but they eradicated it because they were using water for irrigation, for power, and what malaria mosquitoes need is still water. But development brought all water to move. So that was an important way to get rid of malaria. And get the culture right. Well, I think here is the error of causality again. It's maybe wrong. And we could say get the corruption right is what I should put there at the bottom. I consider that being added. But the missing dimension has always been get the economic activities right. This is what they don't want to. This is what they don't want to admit. So, a couple of slides more, and then I think we'll call it a day. But they're too complicated slides, okay? The Marshall Plans. This is the virtuous and vicious circles, and this was the development economics of the 1950s and 60s, when the world was distributing economic activities based on something called the Havana Charter. The Havana Charter was an agreement that was the start of the World Trade Organization, and it was signed by all 59 members of the United Nations at the time in Havana, Cuba, long before Castro. And the Havana Charter said, if you have a national plan of industrialization, you can protect your industry. If you have unused resources, if you have unemployment, if you have capital which is you can't employ at home, you can protect your industry. So I think we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can say we want to go back to the Havana Charter of 1949, which produced that fantastic growth up to 1970, right? So even in the WTO agreements today, there are roots, there are some traces of this Havana Charter. But it should be, if somebody asks what are we in favor of, well, we see, the Havana Charter was extremely successful. We should look at that and try to build it up again. So remember the productivity explosion? We're saying that productivity increases are activity specific. If you're in the right industry, you have higher real wages. But if you lower the export rate at the same export prices at the same rate as the productivity increases, like you would do in agriculture, well, then you exit the system. If you have higher real wages, you have higher demand, higher savings, higher possibility for taxation, better health, education, etc. And very important, labor-saving technologies pay off. So you get into a large scale of production, highly diversified economies, systemic synergies, high investments and high profits, economies of scale and scope, and higher capital-labor ratio. And then if we think of not the Ukraine, but Africa, Latin America, many people will say, like Malthus, that the problem is overpopulation. And I'm tending to think that people are rational. Let's say if an adult couple needs 3 living children in order to survive, and to make the calculation easy, the infant mortality is 50%. You need 3 children, infant mortality is 50%. How many children do you have? 6, right?
Yeah.
And probably one more to be on the safe side. 7, right? So I think.
This is impossible.
Yes, yeah. No, because you are in a different situation, because what happens with deindustrialization is what happens in when Aboriginal culture die off, people stop having children. So this is, the post-industrial problem is very different from the pre-industrial problem, right? So this is the pre-industrial problem in terms of children. You are almost, well, I don't know. Russia has definitely the opposite problem, right? So this feeds. This is the virtuous circle, the economies of scale and scope, higher capital labor ratio, which feeds into new innovations, and this loop here is reinforcing. And if you take out one thing, if you take out health and education, well, you're not really causing, Bill Gates and his foundation want to cure all illnesses, right? That's fine if they do that, but that doesn't solve the development problem. In my view, if I'm very cynical, I say if you avoid child mortality, well, people, they will just die a little older. That's very cynical. But and if you, as I said, if you only attack education, you will educate for migration. The good timing of the East Asian tigers was that they had an enormous education of new engineers, but they also had economic activities. They created economic activities that could absorb all these engineers, that could employ them, right? So that you have to coordinate these things. And then the vicious circles. If you're engaged in productivity, production of technologically mature products, a product subject to diminishing returns, there's a productivity increase, perfect international competition, reversible wages, right? If there are new grains which give more productivity to the wheat business, well, then wages won't go up. The prices are likely to go down. No increase in real wages. Demand is low. Saving is low. Low productivity. Low possibility for taxation. You get poor health, etc. And very important, investment in labor-saving technology is not profitable. I mean, this mechanism we tend not to see. I, as a businessman, know that I've experienced that in Italy, where there was high inflation and wages went up very fast. I invested in machinery because machinery was suddenly profitable, and this is where we have to go. And here is a really bad combination in a country like the Ukraine. You have very high interest rate and very low labor costs. That's not the right incentive. Yeah. So how can you get this virtuous circle going? Small scale of production, imports cheaper due to scale economies, no diversity of production, and sometimes you only have monopolies. We talked about that. If there's only one car producer in the country, well, then there is no incentive to be cheap. So it's important also to have competition. Low investments, low capital labor ratio, balance of payment problems, breakdown of the capacity to import, many children is an asset, and population will grow, low wages to other nations, and comparative advantage in labor-intensive activities. This is very much development economics in the 50s and 60s and early 70s was based on this kind of thinking, right? And these were things that were seen in Latin America, and that's why there are many things that I recognize here in the Ukraine, which is kind of a mirror image of the debate in Latin America early on. So there's something to learn from here. So I think you've been very patient for a long time. So let's do you have any questions? We'll deal with that. If not, we'll tomorrow we'll start with the financial side. But please, if you have, yes. Yes?
Your brother, President of CNT Ukraine. Thank you, Professor Reinhardt, for brilliant today speech. I have two questions. One question about your qualification of economists. Why Zomber and Schmoller was practically prohibited after World War II? It's the first question, and the second question maybe return to Karl Polanyi slide with three parts based of capitalism. That's capitalism. Money, land is main. My question is: Ukraine a capitalist country now, or not capitalist?
Okay,
money is IMF.
Yes, I understand.
Land is our MP culture. Market of land is prohibited.
Yeah.
You have no base of capitalism.
I think you are, in a sense, in a colonial situation. The key aspect of colonialism was that the colonies were not allowed to have manufacturing industries. That's why the Americans rebelled. They could only produce tar and masts and things like that. But this has been forgotten. So I think forcing nations to stay only with raw materials is a typical colonial situation. So I can think, well, if we have a very broad definition of capitalism, then the EU is in a sense forcing you to be in a semi-colonial situation. And I think I was so mad with that Swede. I mean, really, in the forum, he really annoyed me. So I don't get that annoyed that easily. But I thought that arrogance was awful. So there's a problem here that after World War II, German economics, which was the typical non-English economics, this American expression of throwing out the baby with the bathing water, right? So the German theorists were thrown out with the bathing water. And when the German translation of my book, I made a list of 32 German economists that Germans should read again. Right? So these are the guys you Germans have forgotten. Go back to them. And Schmoller is a brilliant economist. Schmoller was the guy who, when he became the rector of the University of Berlin, he talked about the irrational twins. And the irrational twins were Manchester liberalism and communism. The people with this extremely simplistic solutions. And Sombart is more complicated. Sombart wrote a book around 1907, The Jews and Capitalism. And he was so pro-Jewish. He said that the Jews, the Jewish people had invented everything, and they explored. They found the Americas, and he went over the top. So but he was also very much a subject to fashion. So when the fascists came into fashion, he liked part of what they were saying as well. But they hated him because he was so positive to the Jews. So it's very, very complicated. But we're publishing his work now in 4 thick volumes, 800,000 words. Sombart's Modern Capitalism, for the first time in English. So I had to study this guy. And I found that modern Jewish scholars say that the Zionists loved Sombart, because he said he said that the Jewish people were superior to all other people. And the Jews who wanted to be integrated, they disliked him, right? Which is kind of logical. But what he said, of course, in light of what happened in the 1930s and 40s, it comes in a very, very different light. So Sombart is problematic, but how people now think he was anti-Semitic. But who was the man who translated Sombart into Hebrew was David Ben Gurion, the first the first president of Israel. How anti-Jewish can he have been if Ben Gurion translated it? So this is a very messy story. But I think what's coming out of it now is that he was so pro-Jewish that he kind of backfired, and so he's problematic to get back. And I spoke to the editor of the Zeit about something completely different. The big German journal, the Zeit, and I'm saying, we're republishing Sombart, and it's problematic for these reasons. and this gentleman, Mr. Joffe, said, "I would be pleased to write the foreword. I'm a Jew." So some people understand it, right? So we have to get a Jew to write the foreword in order not to be attacked. And my son says, don't publish these things. You only get into trouble. But I think his understanding of capitalism, he's the one who says Venice was the birth of everything. Venetian bookkeeping, Venetian banking, or Genovese banking, he's very important for us to understand capitalism. That's why my son said, well, you should only publish that when you're very old then. because it's kind of risky. But we should take the debate, because once you get into it, I think it makes sense. I think the Ben Gurion argument is, it cannot have been, and we have statements from his Jewish students. And a Peruvian economist is a friend of mine. His father studied with Sombart in Germany, and Sombart had said to his Jewish students, "I think you should leave the country." in 1930, you know. But the thing is here, we haven't cleaned up that mess of the 1930s. We really haven't, and we get to that tomorrow when we talk about finance. That the leftovers from the 30s, which still bother us. There was a question there in the back. You're welcome. So, yeah.
I have a question. What challenge and perils do you see to the state that is going on the way of globalization? For example, what perils and challenges it will face?
Well, I think what I'm trying to say, I don't care really if the important thing is that you industrialize. What percentage of that industry should be owned by the state? I don't know. It's a matter of taste. The important thing is that you have an industry. What we have seen in Norway was that Norway was a country with few capitalists. So when it came to industrialization, when there was no capital, the state was the entrepreneur of last resort. So people say, we would really like the private to do this, but there isn't enough private capital, so the government have to do it. And they grudgingly had the government do it because they knew they had to do it. Right? So I think this is the ideological thing, and what has been successful, I think, in a country like Norway is that the state has moved in, and then when the things start rolling, you privatize. Right? So in 1947, the Scandinavian governments got together and said, we need an airline. The air transportation is the future. So the three governments got together and started an airline. When that airline is doing well, sell it, right? Which they don't do. But so I think the thing is here.
Lack of capital. Lack of capital.
Lack of capital is a reason for the state to do it. But here, I think you have capital that you should try to convert from agriculture to industry. Some countries like the Philippines have never managed to do that successfully, right? So this is a dilemma. How do you convert feudal capital into industrial capital? Some countries have managed, and some haven't. And it has a lot to do with the mentality. If these capitalists read the picture, if they understand what's in the interest of the country, and they are truly nationalistic, then I think you can do it with the right kinds of incentives. Because I think it is important. Back to England and 1485. Foreign skills are much more important than foreign capital. In the Ukraine, I started talking to that in Georgia, in Tbilisi. Sorry, I started talking to the prime minister. They have a great agricultural sector with all these ecological niches. They have one place the blueberries ripen in June, another in August, another in September. So they can, if they get organized, they can supply the European market with blueberries for the whole season. But you need skills. You should. A bit like Switzerland. So I suggested they should have a Swiss strategy, which is like every village has its own cheese, and have their own meat products, etc., etc. And the prime minister took out his cell phone and said, "I'll show you a picture from where I visited a small cheese factory, a dairy plant last week, and the Swiss had come and liked it in Georgia, and he put up a cheese factory and we both agreed that the thing to do was to let this Swiss guy teach all the small cooperatives, create cooperatives. Turan Baranovsky is the cooperative guy, right? So let the Swiss guy travel around and teach everyone. And then he said, we also had a Dutch guy here who came on a bicycle to Georgia. He liked it so much, so he brought his family, and they are now creating they're improving the race of cows in Georgia with more productive genes from Holland and from everywhere. And this is exactly what you want to do, right? And Georgia has produces walnuts. If they managed to organize the small producers of walnut in a cooperative and finance a walnut oil factory, you increase the productivity, the export value of those things by 4 times. This is Pinochet's trick with wine. Prohibit the export of wine in bulk and force them to export it in bottles. And there's similar tricks with wheat. The different kinds of wheat. So this is the value added, and this is when my first job for UNCTAD and for the Swiss Foreign Service, Swiss Development Agency. I was 23 years old, and I was sent to Latin America, and this was the message. I was traveling around in Latin America in 1972 with this message, right? And I was an expert. 23 years old, I was an expert. So I've never trusted experts after that, right? And an expert is somebody who's far away from home. But this is an ideology, a way of thinking that has gone out of fashion. But if you look at these countries with a huge deficit, on a huge trade deficit, who in the long run cannot pay for their imports, well, these are the tricks. And they're really old tricks that worked in Latin America. But then they went out of fashion. This is a cyclical thing again. In Latin America, real wages in Latin America from 1950 to 1975, rose enormously. Even in Central America, 10% a year. And then the whole thing collapsed again. So that's why history is important. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. There are risks, but I think if you should err on the side of perhaps doing a little too much, and make sure that there is competition. I think this is important. This is what went wrong with African industrialization. We need to produce bicycles. Well, you get a monopoly for producing bicycles in Uganda. Well, if you do that, he imports all the pieces and he puts it together, and it's shoddy quality, and it costs 3 times as importing a bike from somewhere else, right? These are the traps. Yeah. So this is the So this is the difference between industrialization with Oscar Lange and the planned economy on one side, and Liszt on the other, who insisted on competition. So.
Question about IMF and Washington institutions' role you mentioned. On the one hand, you outlined inefficient advices they gave during past time. On the other hand, low interest rate, positive sign for private investors, pressure on corrupted elites in the country. So, what is the IMF and World Bank role is? Is it really vicious tool of rich world for keeping developing world in miserable condition and dependency, or recipient countries just cannot make use of it properly? And what should Ukraine do in relationship with IMF?
Well, there's certainly both. They are, since the 1990s, the World world would have been a better place without the World Bank, I've no doubt. But things are changing, and I think the Ukraine should, intellectuals should rise and protest where they're wrong. But the World Bank got a new chief economist this summer, Paul Romer. And Paul Romer is reinventing Botero and Serra. Paul Romer is talking about the role of cities. So he's been an outsider for a long time. I met him the first time in 1991 in a conference in Maastricht. And he's always been a loner. He comes from a social class where he doesn't have to bother. His father was the governor of the state of Indiana, I think. Right? So here is a guy who doesn't have any complexes. He has no inferiority complex. So he dares to think independently, which is good. And so I think he doesn't quote Serra or anything like that. But there are economists, an American woman, Jane Jacobs, who's talking about she's the one with the example that in a city, the butcher watches the baby in the carriage while the mother goes up to the third floor to give an old lady soup, right? This is Jane Jacobs, and this is the kind of cities she wants. So, I think he's good news because he's thinking differently. And IMF also this summer admitted that they made a big mistake in Greece. And I think what you should try to say is, try to reconstruct that argument and say to the IMF, well, are you sure you're not making the same mistake in Georgia, that in Ukraine that you did in Greece? I think they are making the same mistake here. So the good thing is that this whole thing, this whole house of cards is kind of collapsing. But one of the very bad things about Latin American countries, you see that for a long time, the only thing they're focused about is how much money can we get from abroad. That's not the important thing. The important thing is producing something, right? And I've spoken to a few medium-sized enterprises, owners of medium-sized enterprises, and they say, the government doesn't trust us. The medium-sized enterprises are really supporting the whole structure, the big ones and the small ones, and they are frustrated because they feel that the government, or the few I've talked to, that the government doesn't trust them in their role of producing, right? Because too much focus is on corruption, too much focus is how can we maximize the inflow of money from abroad, right? So it's production matters, I think, and use the weaknesses of the IMF. You need them for some extent, but I think you should also say, look at Poland and other countries that got their debt written off. Maybe you are in a situation where your debt should be written off, like the Greek one, right? And then you say, well, so and so happened in Poland. Why don't you? Why don't you allow it here? But clearly the EU, if they could reverse the decision of allowing Poland into the EU, they would do it. I'm pretty sure.
But not back the money.
Yes. So you see these tensions within the EU, and Greece is in an awful situation. I was in Portugal in July, and we know that the wages in Spain are very low, but we don't know that the wages in Portugal are half of the wages in Spain. So Portugal is a disaster. So the interesting thing here is that also inside the EU, manufacturing is dying off. That's why, if they can stop yours and perhaps save some in Spain and Portugal, they won't do that. So that's part of your problem. That's why I'm saying that in a sense you are much more alone than you think. But you're alone not with 1 million, but with 44 million people. Or 40 something. I think that is important. But you had a question also.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor. We just discussed with Yuri Pivovar and Mr. Ginkel one very interesting question. Yeah? We can have number of patterns, policies, or tools within the other canon. Yeah. But what's your vision? What's the role of the cultural context, of the religious context? If there is an influence, and if there is some restrictions for, is it some kind of reality sector we can move in, or we can choose wherever we want? So what's the historic and cultural context for the policy we can use?
Well, I think that the New Testament is very important. So the Old Testament religions I think have some problems. I mean, Muslims and Jews, because they You know, they don't have this element of turning the other cheek, and they don't have an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. You know, they don't have this vengeance culture, and so I think whatever the countries that have the New Testament have an advantage, I think. And then there is the old story: is it Protestantism or Catholicism? And if you look back, Max Weber's argument is famous: the Protestant ethic. Well, you know, capitalism was born, you know, 350 years before Luther was born. so this is really not true at all. But Luther was interesting. We just published, you know, I'm trying to publish forgotten texts like somebody, and we just published Luther's book from 1524 on trade and usury, and you see how he understands that interests have to be paid, but you also see why is he so mad? Why is he so mad at the Catholics? He's so mad at them because they extract money out of circulation and they hoard it in Rome. So it's the mammon argument, right? So he is for the circulation of money, and he actually knew a lot about business because his father and two brothers were in the mining business. So Luther was not. So I think in terms of culture and religion, I think two arguments. One is that economic development is caused by less religion. Whatever religion it is, it's less of it. But you still need it. You still need the ethics, right? So this is an argument of an English economic historian called Tawney. So, and I think that's true. But I also think it's true that actually when there are tensions, not tensions, but where different cultures meet, you get very positive development. If you look at Holland, you know, in the 1600s, Holland was the richest country in the world. And if you look at what happened, it was some cities were mainly Catholic and were very successful. Some were Protestant and they were also successful, and some were very mixed. And probably the mixed thing is important. So diversity, you know, like look at nature, how this diversity is very important, and therefore I think diversity to some extent, diversity of races and of cultures is important. You know, you shouldn't get so much diversity that your own culture is killed. But diversity is important. And I think one example from Singapore. You remember the huge tsunami? When was it? A few years ago, right? It was around Christmas time, and one of the early days of January, a week or 10 days afterwards, my wife and I were coming from Indonesia to Singapore by boat. And the taxi we took from the port, the taxi driver asked us, well, why do you think that the tsunami didn't hit Singapore? And I said, well, you know, the island of Java was in between. That wasn't the correct answer. The correct answer was that in Singapore we have 6 religions, so you have all praying to the same God. And because 6 different religions are praying to the same God, he has to listen to us. I think that's a wonderful argument. And it proves the diversity thing again.
Just a remark about religion. Zomber discussed with Weber, and
yes.
He wrote that Weber's thesis about Benjamin Franklin's principles, Protestant principles, were in the book of Alberti.
Yes.
Italian economist in Florence.
In Florence, yes.
So
De La Familia, yeah.
Catholic principles of Christian, and Zomber wrote that the first rational organization of business or economy was in monastery, monks thought that it's a sin to not rationally use the food or other things that given by God.
We shouldn't waste the gifts of God. Yes. So healthy religion is I think is really good. What language did you read somebody? Russian. The only
original bourgeois.
Yeah, but this whole work which we now have translated into English, the only language which it has been translated into until now is Russian. So Sombat was very influential, I think, in a positive way, in Russia. Yeah, you're right. And you know what? The best-selling economic book ever, the one with the maximum number of editions, is Benjamin Franklin's. It's the one called Poor Richard or something like that. The one with the principles of wealth. 1,125 editions between 1770 and 1850. I mean, you see, it was published. It was a thin book, and they didn't publish everything. But 4 different little cities in Finland, 3 different little cities in Norway. It was published, and this is the ethical part of capitalism. It's early to bed and early to rise makes a man wealthy and wise, or something like that. You have these maxims which are in a sense religious, and you're absolutely right. Alberti invented them, and this was a big fight between Sombat and Weber. And the problem is that everybody except Weber have disappeared from that debate. So we're only left with Weber, and we don't have the guys who correctly disagree with him. And this is what we're publishing a book now, more than 800 pages, which we should launch here in Kiev, I think also, called Elgar Handbook to Alternative Development Economics. So we have 40 different chapters from all different angles, and here we're actually making that point about Alberti.
Christianity could be a basis of such.
I think, and I think even if you look at Marx, who said that religion was the opium of the people, his values were Christian, anti-poverty and things like that. So whether it's conscious or not conscious, that ethics has to be in there. And I think here the New Testament is I think is very important. So you don't have that problem.
We have time.
We're out of time. Yes.
I have to have a short announcement.
Sure.
Yeah, I already announced.